Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this, because today we are unpacking what might honestly be the greatest, most shocking corporate true crime story in human history. Seriously, we're looking at a private company that started out with just a piece of paper and somehow ended up swallowing an entire subcontinent, only to spectacularly collapse under the weight of its own greed.
To really wrap our heads around this story, we have to start with this massive, head-scratching paradox. On one side, you've got the officers of the East India Company returning home to Britain with just unimaginable, mind-boggling personal fortunes. But on the other side, the East India Company itself, this massive monopoly extracting immense wealth from India, was completely broke. They were literally begging for a government bailout. So, you have to ask yourself, how does a company with the keys to the richest region on Earth manage to bankrupt itself while making its employees richer than kings? Well, to find out, we need to rewind the clock.
Picture this. The year is 1599. India is under the rule of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, and it is an absolute economic powerhouse. According to modern economic estimates, India at this time accounted for roughly 25% of the entire global economy. Indian spices, cotton, indigo, and silk were absolutely flooding markets from Asia all the way to Europe. It was the ultimate prize.
Now, thousands of miles away in London, a group of highly ambitious men were watching all this wealth with very hungry eyes. They called themselves merchant adventurers. Think of them kind of like the ultra-aggressive startup founders of their day. They desperately wanted a piece of this Eastern wealth, and they knew that this dangerous overseas trade could bring them limitless profits. But outfitting ships, hiring sailors, and buying weapons for a months-long sea voyage, that was incredibly expensive and risky. So they decided to pool their capital. But they had one massive fear: market competition. They desperately needed a rock-solid guarantee that no other English merchants could undercut them.
And, well, they got exactly what they wanted. On the very last day of the year, December 31, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I issued a royal charter. This crucial document gave them a 15-year monopoly on all English trade in the East, meaning any independent British merchant caught trading in this huge area could literally have their ships and goods seized. The charter also set up the ultimate corporate hierarchy, a governor and 24 members, initially called committees, which later became the famous Court of Directors based in London. Crucially, it also gave this private corporation the power to create rules and enforce discipline over its own employees abroad. It was the seed of a massive corporate empire.
At first, they were really just foreigners begging for a foot in the door. As you can see, in 1615, the English envoy Thomas Roe visits Emperor Jahangir's court simply to ask for trading rights. But as the company set up trading hubs, which they called factories, in Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, their footprint started to grow. And just to be clear, these weren't manufacturing plants. They were massive walled compounds with warehouses, residences, and eventually a booming local population of artisans and merchants. By 1687, they established the Madras Municipal Corporation, the oldest in India actually, to manage local taxes and sanitation, and by 1726, they had set up mayor's courts in the three major presidency towns to handle civil disputes. So a private trading company was slowly building the skeleton of a government.
Let's move to and see how this builds, mapping out this totally aggressive pivot from simple trade to full-scale militarization. This shift from merchants to a military force definitely didn't happen overnight. It was driven largely by fierce, often violent competition with French trading companies. To protect their assets, the East India Company began raising armies, recruiting Indian soldiers, and training them under European officers. Slowly, the line between business and politics just vanished. They started intervening in local succession disputes, offering military support in exchange for land and trade privileges.
The ultimate tipping point came in Bengal, which was India's most prosperous province. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, the company used conspiracy and betrayal to defeat the Nawab of Bengal, instantly turning them into kingmakers. But their hunger for control only grew. Just 7 years later, in 1764, the Battle of Buxar changed absolutely everything. This time, it wasn't just backroom deals, it was a pure display of military might. The company defeated the combined forces of the Mughal Emperor, the Nawab of Awadh, and the former Nawab of Bengal. The merchants had officially become the undisputed military masters of the region.
And as they say, to the victor go the spoils. In 1765, under the Treaty of Allahabad, the Mughal emperor was forced to hand over the Diwani rights to the East India Company for Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Guys, this was a monumental shift. Diwani rights meant the company now had the legal authority to collect land revenue, meaning taxes, from millions of people. For a trading company, this was the ultimate cheat code. They didn't have to ship silver from London to buy Indian goods anymore. They simply used Indian tax money to buy Indian goods and then used the rest of it to fund their massive private wars.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Robert Clive engineered a completely cruel and ruthless system called the dual government. The company kept all the financial power and tax collection for itself, but they completely dodged the actual responsibility of ruling. They left the local Nawab in charge of law and order, police, and public welfare. So you had this wild situation where the company hoarded all the wealth with absolutely zero accountability, while the Nawab had all the responsibility with no money to actually govern. The company even outsourced the tax collection to ruthless middlemen who just squeezed the local farmers dry.
This completely parasitic system set the stage for one of history's truly great human tragedies. In 1769, the monsoon rains failed in Bengal and Bihar, leading to a severe drought. Now, natural droughts don't always have to become catastrophic famines, but it was the East India Company's relentless greed that turned a bad harvest into an absolute nightmare. As crops withered and food prices skyrocketed, the company flat out refused to lower its tax demands. Company officials and local merchants literally hoarded grain to sell at insanely inflated prices just for their own personal profit.
The human cost here is just staggering. Historical estimates suggest that around 10 million people died. To put that into perspective, that's roughly 1/3 of the entire population of the affected region. Villages were completely abandoned as starving farmers fled their land in a desperate search for food, only to fall victim to spreading diseases. The agricultural backbone of Bengal was utterly devastated, and yet the company violently enforced its revenue collections right through the height of the starvation.
Meanwhile, back in England, a deeply disturbing contrast was emerging. While millions starved in Bengal, East India Company officers were returning to London dripping in unimaginable wealth. They bought grand estates, bribed their way into Parliament, and basically flaunted their unearned riches. The British public viewed them with deep suspicion and actually coined a super sarcastic derogatory term for them, nabobs, which was a mangled British pronunciation of the Indian title Nawab. Robert Clive and his peers had become the ultimate symbols of spectacular, unchecked corruption.
Which brings us right back to the paradox we started with. Follow the money here. While the individual nabobs were getting filthy rich, the East India Company itself was bleeding out. By 1772, they hit a massive financial wall. Look at this breakdown. Their revenue was in free fall because the agricultural lands they taxed were ruined by the famine. Meanwhile, their expenses were skyrocketing just from maintaining a massive standing army. They had massive stockpiles of unsold tea just sitting and rotting in London warehouses. And incredibly, to keep up appearances, the directors just kept paying out massive dividends to shareholders, even as their cash reserves completely evaporated.
So the mighty East India Company, the so-called masters of Bengal, had absolutely no choice but to go to the British Parliament with their hat in hand, begging for a massive bailout. And this sent shockwaves through Britain. The company was so deeply entangled with British banks, prominent politicians, and investors that if they collapsed, they could literally take the entire British economy down with them. But Parliament, led by Prime Minister Lord North, looked at this and realized they had a total monster on their hands. This wasn't just a trading firm anymore. It was a rogue corporation fighting wars, conquering territory, and ruling millions, all without an ounce of democratic oversight. Parliament agreed to give them the bailout money, but at a very steep price: total oversight and structural reform.
The crucial takeaway here is that 1773 basically marked the death of the independent, unregulated East India Company. The British Parliament passed the Regulating Act, stepping directly into the administration of India for the very first time. They were absolutely no longer going to let a board of directors sitting in London blindly dictate the fate of an entire subcontinent. The wild, unchecked era of corporate looting was officially being forced into a new, heavily regulated colonial era under the watchful eye of the British state.
But, as you can probably guess, inserting the British government into the mess the company created wasn't exactly a magic fix. In fact, it was the beginning of an entirely new era of conflict and constitutional chaos. The balance of power was shifting permanently. So, what does this all mean? How will this new law, meant to leash a rogue trading company, fundamentally alter the political destiny of India? And how are the new state-appointed officials going to clash with the old corporate guard? Well, that is a massive story for another time. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.